Okay, in this video we're going to talk about bone structure. So bones are considered organs. Now we know that bone itself, or osseous tissue, is a tissue type you find in bones. However, bone also has nervous tissue, cartilage, other fibrous connective tissue, muscle cells, and epithelial cells. And you find this all throughout bone, therefore we consider bones as an organ themselves, although they do contain bony tissue. Now, we can look at bones in terms of different levels. So the gross anatomical level, which is basically what you can see with the unaided eye, just basically visually what do bones look like. But we can also study bones at their microscopic and chemical levels, which is ultimately what we're going to focus on mostly in this chapter. So there's two major types of bone. We got compact bone versus spongy bone. Compact bone is a dense outer layer that you find on every bone that appears smooth and solid, and it forms a nice sort of outer boundary to bones. But it's typically kind of thin. And deeper in bones, you're going to find spongy bone, which is made of more of a honeycomb, small, needle-like, flat pieces of bone called trabeculae. And these actually have open spaces that are filled with marrow, either red or yellow marrow. But spongy bone is kind of a lighter material that fills in bones and helps to make your bones lighter, and also helps to resist tension in those bones as well. Now, in terms of the structure of short, irregular, and flat bones, you have thin plates of spongy bone, what is called diplo, that are covered by compact bone. Now, compact bone is sandwiched between connective tissue membranes called periosteum and endosteum. Periosteum is what surrounds the outside of compact bone. You would find this surrounding the whole outer surface of bones of your body. And the purpose of this is that periosteum serves as a nice attachment point for tendons and ligaments. It's kind of a dense fibrous tissue. Now, endosteum is actually what covers the inner chambers of bone, specifically spongy bone. And you'd find this in the inner surfaces of that, those diplo. And what endosteum does, it essentially nourishes the bone from the inside because it's made of a kind of an areolar type of connective tissue. Now, bone marrow is also scattered throughout the spongy bone. There's no defined marrow cavity in spongy bone. However, marrow is sort of distributed in all those spaces. You also find that hyaline cartilage can cover the area of bone that's part of a movable joint. So in bones that move against each other at a joint, you often find hyaline cartilage cushioning that joint, which we call articular cartilage. So this is showing an example of a flat bone here, like your parietal bone. If you zoom in on this, you'd find that we have compact bone and compact bone with spongy bone sandwiched in the middle. This spongy bone we call diploid, and within these spaces you would find red or yellow marrow, and endosteum would also line the inner surfaces of these spaces. And you can see that it actually is pretty airy in there. You see there's a lot of space here, and it essentially helps to make the bone less dense and therefore not as heavy. Now, in terms of the structure of a typical long bone, they all have a diaphysis and an epiphysis. The diaphysis is the shaft, and the bony rounded ends are called the epiphyses. The diaphysis is a tubular shaft that forms a long axis of the bone. It consists of compact bone that surrounds a medullary cavity that's typically filled with yellow marrow. Epiphyses are the rounded ends of the long bone that also have compact bone on the outside, but they're filled with spongy bone internally. And you also find that articular cartilage covers the joint surfaces at these ends as well, which helps to form a nice protective cushion between these bones that are articulating or connecting. Now, between the diaphysis and epiphysis, we actually have something called the epiphyseal line. The epiphyseal line is the remnant of your growth plate, also called the epiphyseal plate. In the epiphyseal plate, which we'll go into more detail in a future video, but the epiphyseal plate is essentially made of hyaline cartilage, and it divides to help form cartilage that becomes bone. So looking at the structure of a typical long bone here, we see that we have the articular cartilage at the ends, or epiphyses, and it helps to form a nice protective cushion where these bones would meet other bones. And the whole rounded end of the long bone is called the epiphysis, and the centrally elongated portion is called the shaft, or diaphysis. You find that in the epiphysis, you have a lot of spongy bone, which would be filled with red or yellow marrow. And then in the diaphysis, it's actually mostly just a large open cavity called the medullary cavity. Well, medulla means marrow, so it makes sense that the medullary cavity is the marrow cavity. And in adults, it contains a lot of yellow bone marrow, which is basically just a lot of triglycerides. So it's a way to just store fat. Now, the outside of your bones are surrounded by periosteum. You can see that here, where it's a kind of a dense fibrous tissue that surrounds the outside of the bone. And then the inner surfaces would be lined with endosteum as well. Now, bone is highly vascular, which is why you see lots of blood vessels diving down into it. And it makes sense why it's so vascular, because bone is an organ. It molds and changes quite a bit. In fact, the site of new bone growth lengthwise is called the epiphyseal plate. Now, there is no growth plate here because this is an adult's bone. And you can see that now it's called the epiphyseal line, which is a little line of compact bone that used to be cartilage. While this individual was growing, this would have been a cartilaginous plate called the epiphyseal plate, which forms a nice dividing line between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And in fact, you'd find this epiphyseal line on both sides, not just the proximal, but also the distal epiphysis as well. Now, if you zoom in on the edge of the bone here, we find that compact bone lines the outside, spongy bone is deeper, and they're pretty just easily identifiable based on the fact that this one looks more dense and compact, this one looks more spongy. Now, compact bone is the one that's made of complete osteons. You can see that here. These sort of circular patterns here are called osteons. They're like rings on a tree, and they essentially help to form the structural unit of compact bone. Now, spongy bone is made of incomplete osteons, and the reason why they're incomplete is they used to be from compact bone, and this was broken down into something that became more spongy and diplo-like. And if this is an area of bone that is near a joint, typically you're going to find some articular cartilage here, which is a little band of hyaline cartilage that can help cushion between this bone and another bone. That way you have cartilage bumping up against cartilage, which forms a nice protective cushion. Now, in terms of other membranes, we have periosteum and endosteum. Remember, periosteum, peri means surrounding, and osteum is bone. So periosteum is a layer of whitish tissue that surrounds the outside of bone, and other than the ones that participate in joints. So if there's articular cartilage, there's no periosteum there. Otherwise, the periosteum would surround the rest of the bone, and there's two layers of periosteum. We have a fibrous layer and an osteogenic layer. The fibrous layer is the outermost, or more superficial, and it consists of a dense, irregular connective tissue and Sharpie's fibers that dive down into the bone and secure to the bony matrix itself. Now, closer to the bone, we have an osteogenic layer, which is an inner layer, so deeper, that abuts the bone and contains these osteogenic cells, or stem cells. The function of osteogenic cells is to essentially help to divide into new bone-forming cells to help either repair or replenish damaged bone. Now, we also find that periosteum contains a lot of nerve fibers and blood vessels, and these can help to nourish bone through nutrient foramen, which allow for nerve fibers and blood vessels to dive down deep into bone. So endosteum is much different than periosteum. For one, it's within bone, hence the name endo. So endosteum is within that bone. It lines the inner surfaces of bone, and it's more of a delicate connective tissue. It's not really there for anchoring and support so much as nourishment of the inner lining of the bone. And it covers the trabeculae of spongy bone. You find this lining canals that pass through compact bone as well. And like the periosteum, you also find some osteogenic cells here, which can help to differentiate into other bone cells, especially if the bone's been fractured. You have another source of stem cells. So just to differentiate between the two, remember we see our periosteum here. We have two layers. We have the fibrous layer and the osteogenic layer. So the fibrous layer is more of a dense fibrous tissue whose function is to serve as attachment or anchoring of other tissues. And then the osteogenic layer will be right up against the bone. This contains stem cells that can help to nourish the bone, or at least replenish the bone or help with bone fracture repair. Inside of bone, we have endosteum. And endosteum is more of a areolar, loose connective tissue that helps to nourish bone from the inside. It also contains osteogenic cells that are there to help repair bone. Now, what's interesting too is that within the bony chambers, we can find red marrow or yellow marrow. Now, red marrow is called that because it has kind of a reddish appearance to it. You find this within the trabecular cavities of spongy bone, of flat bones like your sternum, and as well as the heads of your femur and humerus. Otherwise, it's pretty difficult to find red marrow beyond that. You find that most spaces within bone actually are filled with yellow marrow in adults. However, in newborns, the medullary cavities and most spongy bone cavities contain red marrow. It makes sense because newborns need a lot of blood cells. Now, red marrow can be converted to red. Yellow marrow can be converted to red if a person becomes anemic. So if someone has widespread blood loss, their yellow marrow contains stem cells that can divide and then turn into red marrow to help replenish lost blood cells. Now, bone markings are basically sites of muscle, ligament, and tendon attachment on external surfaces. And these are often areas that are involved with joint formation or conduits for blood vessels and nerves. So you find that a lot of bone markings are associated with the epiphyses of long bones. And they can be things like projections or depressions or openings. And they're often going to be passageways for nutrients or blood vessels to pass through bone. Or they can be attachment points for tendons and ligaments. Now, there's three types of markings. We got projections, depressions, and openings. Projections are an outward bulge of bone. They can be due to increased stress from muscle pull. Depressions are a bowl or groove-like cut that serves as a passageway for vessels or nerves or plays a role in joints. And then openings are basically holes or canals that serve as a passageway for blood vessels and nerves. So what this table shows are just some of the different terms we use in anatomy to help differentiate between the different bone markings. So these are showing the different types of projections. Remember, projections are usually sites for muscle and ligament attachment. So we find that tuberosities are all of those bony features that are large, rounded projections that may be roughened. And a crest is more of a narrow ridge of bone, usually kind of prominent. Trochanters are very large, blunt, irregularly shaped processes, like the greater and lesser trochanters of the femur. Again, these are projections for muscle attachment. We have lines, which are more of a narrow ridge. So a line is like more of a narrow form of a crest, so it's not as prominent. Tubercles are small, rounded projections or processes, also for bone or ligament attachment. And then epicondyles are raised areas that are above a condyle. And a condyle is essentially a smooth area of bone that's for joint articulation or connection. And epicondyles are usually just near the condyle, and they're also for muscle attachment. Spines are sharp, slender processes, and processes are just any bony prominence. So what you'll find is when you go through the gross anatomy of the skeletal system, these words show up a lot. There's different tuberosities of our body, different crests and lines and tubercles. And what's common are these features, even though they would have a different name associated with them as well. So projections that also help to form joints are things like heads and facets. A head is just a bony expansion on a narrow neck. A facet is a smooth, nearly flat articular surface. And the way I remember facet is think of like a multifaceted gem, where the facet is the smooth, kind of flat surface of a gem. Just like in bones, facets are the smooth and kind of flatter regions. Now, condyles are a rounded articular projection. Example, this is on the mandible here. You have the mandibular condyle, which helps to form the temporomandibular joint. And then a ramus is an arm-like bar of bone. So this is showing the mandibular ramus, which is basically just a large projection that's arm-like, and it's made of bony tissue. Now, depressions and openings, there's lots of different types. You have grooves, fissures, foramen, notches, meatuses, sinuses, and fossa. Now, a groove is just a furrow, and then a fissure is more of a narrow slit-like opening. Foramina are basically round oval openings in bone, which typically allow for the passageway of blood vessels and nerves. Notches are just indentations, and then meatuses are canal-like passageways. A fossa is just a shallow basin-like depression in bone. And a sinus is actually considered a cavity within bone. So if you look here, we can see the frontal sinus, which is basically an air-filled cavity deep within your frontal bone, just like we have a sphenoid sinus as well, which is an air-filled cavity within the sphenoid bone. This is showing the paranasal sinuses, which are actually associated with your nasal cavity. So when people talk about a sinus infection, we're talking about an infection within these air-filled cavities within the bone.